AEDP, which can be a mouthful. It stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy, has finally come of age. In the Institute, we've taken to referring to this as the second decade of AEDP. And ironically, though I have lived most of my life in New York, and this is where it started, it is really finally that I think we have reached a critical threshold. And after AEDP's fantastic growth, particularly on the West Coast, I think the country's tilting. And New York has finally gotten ready for us. So here we are, and here you are, and it's very, very thrilling. And it is a deep and profound model of treatment that has an ethos, it has a conceptual framework, it has a characteristic series of techniques, and very, very important to us, it has an emergent, very precise phenomenology, which is absolutely key to how we do our work. You know, while psychoanalytic theory is probably the most brilliant theory and most comprehensive theory developed to account and explain psychopathology and how psychopathology develops, it is, I think, unequaled in its depth and richness for that. Oddly, because after all, we are therapists. We are engaged in producing change, in healing. You know, psychoanalytic theory, but really, there are very, very few theories out there that are models or theories of change. What are the mechanisms by which the processes that we try to engender and facilitate in psychotherapy, what are the mechanisms by which those events occur? As I really made my own transformation from being a primarily psychodynamic clinician to being an experiential clinician, that the powerful phenomena that I was drawn to in the experiential work did not have an adequate theory. There were sort of phenomena in search of a theory. So it became really, really important, and it became really the center of the study of AEDP as a conceptual framework, which is to account for change mechanisms, and in the process, start to develop a lexicon for notions of healing, for notions of transformation and change. One of the things that's at the heart of AEDP is that it's a healing-oriented, transformation-based model. And that very specifically, what we mean by that is that we regard healing as a process and healing as a potential and not merely as an outcome. In other words, healing is not what results from the theory. Healing is something that the potential for it, the potential for transformation, is something that resides in the individual from the get-go, before they have even set their eyes on you. We strongly and firmly believe, and that you will see this demonstrated over and over and over in the videotapes, that they're really two parallel tracks. In real life, they're completely intertwined, they're always operating at the same time, but they're nevertheless distinct. One is what I named before, is the path by which, in the face of adversity and trauma and misfortune, psychopathology develops. However, there is this other track, side by side, which is the track of healing, it's the track of growth, is the track of self-repair, and it is there from the get-go. You don't have to take care of this to be able to address this. And this is an absolutely fundamental notion. What transformance refers to is that drive within all of us, regardless of the slings and arrows of misfortune, that profound drive within all of us that pulses towards transformation, that pulses towards adaptation, that pulses towards growth, and that pulses towards self-repair. Our goal, as we begin from the first moments of the first clinical interaction, it is our goal to create a safe environment, to co-construct a safe environment, to bring to the fore the self at best or the most resource possible aspects of the patient, and to thus create an environment in which all of these wired-in adaptive change processes can come to the fore. Emotions can become absolutely overwhelming and are at the root of, what fragments the self and requires defense mechanisms to come on board. But when regulated and when held, emotions are huge and massive sources of adaptation. And with adaptation, resilient functioning. Similarly, our bodies are wired to adapt and to foster our thriving and our health, particularly in conditions of safety. So it is this which we seek to do. And from the beginning, we seek to, I've called it being a transformance detective, that we are on the lookout for glimmers of transformance, and that the moment we see them, what was previously foreground becomes background, and that becomes our focus. Particularly for those of you who are new to this work, and for those of you who do come from models that are still fighting the battle of neutrality. Let me say it explicitly and overtly and with pride that this is not about neutrality. When we're talking about the therapist's stance, we're not talking about countertransference lapses. We're not talking about repairing disruptions. We're not talking, no. We have a model that's an attachment and emotion and transformation model. One of the main mechanisms by which we operate is dyadic affect regulation, and you can't do affect with a still face. That's it. You will see us as therapists be engaged, openly empathic, compassionate, delighting in our patients, loving our patients, confronting our patients, sharing our feelings, doing any number that are fundamental to a stance of engagement and presence that will create that attachment. It's how we understand psychopathology. It is that which develops as a result of the individual being alone in the face of overwhelming emotion, right? That it fundamentally has to do with aloneness. And thus what's equally fundamental to the therapeutic work is undoing aloneness. That from the beginning, we want to be together with, and not just as witnesses, and not just as supporters, and not just to empathize, though all of those things are fundamentally important. You know, the importance of existing in the heart and mind of the other, right? That if our patients know and feel and experience and are capable of reflecting on the fact that they exist inside us, really as themselves, meaning not as projections, not as narcissistic extensions, but that the patient exists in our minds and hearts. That will also contribute to attachment security. I think the other aspect that's very important, I'm going here now to practice guidelines, is to promote patient safety and therapist risk-taking. Now, one of the things that makes it safe for us to take risks is the fact that the unit of intervention is not what the therapist says. The unit of intervention is what the therapist says, and then tracking very, very closely the patient's response. Transformational theory becomes translated into clinical practice has to do with phenomenology. We are very, very attentive, and not just attentive, but guided by phenomena. And so that AEDP, rather than it's being a manualized treatment, a how-to sort of first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do that, you will see that one of the beauties of the work that you will see is that it simultaneously reflects the basic core principles of AEDP, but it's transmitted through the uniqueness of each therapist's personality and the uniqueness of each dyad. But it's suffused through their own voices, which I think is very important for those of you who are, doing training and for whom this is new, that you don't have to leave everything that you know at the door. What guides us very, very specifically, thumbs up, keep doing what you're doing. No, thumbs down, this is not the path to go, has to do with very, very, very closely tracking phenomena. We have described and named transformational phenomena. Again, something which has not existed in the field of psychotherapy. I don't mean that the transformational phenomena have not existed. That's ridiculous. We don't invent phenomena. They're wired into our bodies. But we have described them as a result of the work that we try to do. This is when AEDP comes in, that exactly what is the endpoint of a successful session in experiential work, for us, is the beginning of the next round of processing. And that if in state 2, we process emotional experience, and we process it to completion, in state 3, we process transformational experience. And we have discovered that if you process transformational experience rigorously and as assiduously as you process emotional experience, you set off a transformational process. You set off a cascading, spiraling process where more begets more begets more. I will say it very briefly that what I mean by the experience of transformation, if somebody feels better, if somebody feels understood, if somebody feels no longer afraid, if depression lifts, if there's the capacity to have worked through an aspect of a trauma, and the person sort of feels more regulated and capable of really looking at something that had been off limits for a long time, if you then start an inquiry process, an experiential inquiry in what is it like for you? What is it like for you to be able to stand up to your father? What is it like for you to feel understood and cared about by me? What is it like for us to have done this together? What does it, the person will say, boy, I feel stronger. What does stronger feel like? It feels like there's a straight line down my back. And what does that feel like? And through this process, you really evoke this kind of transformational spiral. We have identified 4 different types of transformational processes with their own specific affects. This is where it gets phenomenologically precise. I will be very, very interested to see what Steve Porges makes of this. Number one, the mastery affects. The person, it's joy, confidence, pride. Number two, very often, the experience of having, right, having the undreamed of empathy, changing when you didn't think that change was possible, or healing when you were just about to give up. That those kinds of experiences, and again, I will reference your own personal experience, is that very, very often having something and having it and feeling it in your body makes you all too aware of not having had, right? That having the contact really puts you in touch with the deprivation and with the loss. And that the second of our transformational processes, we call this meta-therapeutic processing, in that we're processing what's therapeutic about therapeutic experiences, is mourning the self, and emotional pain is the affect that characterizes it. It's pain, it's mourning the self. It's the same, it's the grief that we usually have about loss of the other. It's applied to the self, and we call it emotional pain. The third class of affects we call the tremulous affects, which are the good side of fear. They're positive fear. They're the good side of if shock, startle, surprise, novelty. It's basically the reaction to novelty that is sometimes frightening, not because it's triggering the trauma memories, but it's frightening because it is new. It's scary. It's vulnerable. And that's where the attachment relationship becomes fundamental in keeping it progressive and moving forward, and recognizing tremulous affects as the self trembling with novelty as opposed to the self being overwhelmed by trauma. And the last of these is what we call the healing affects, because they both mark healing and they are healing in and of themselves, which is that I spoke to you about mourning of the self, that with having comes the deep grief about not having. With the healing affects, they're the affects that are associated with good experiences, but good experiences by contrast with bad experiences. Having given up hope, all of a sudden you have hope. Thinking that nobody will ever understand, you're understood. Thinking this depression would never lift, you have experiences of vitality. And that and not very often, but that the phenomenology of the healing affects is tears that are not sad tears, they're not tears of fear, they're not tears of depression. If you ask people, they'll tell you, I'm not sad. They're tears of being moved. They're tears of crying of the happy ending. And the challenge for therapists here is that what also wells up around, along with feeling touched and feeling moved, is the feeling of love and gratitude for the other. So you, me, us, as therapists, have to absolutely learn to tolerate the receptive experience of being the recipient of our patients' love and gratitude, which, as you know, is not so easy. But more about that later. One last thing. If you keep processing these affects, the healing affects, the tremulous affects, mourning the self, and process them to completion, eventually the fourth state of the transformational process comes online. And it is what we call core state. And it is a state in which defenses and anxiety and shame and dysregulation are totally absent. There's a sense of calm. It's not the turmoil of the emotions. There's a sense of calm, and its affective marker is the sense of truth. There's the experience that the truth is being spoken. The person speaking has that experience. The person receiving it has that experience, and most often, by the time the patient is in core state, so is the therapist. And that what is absolutely characteristic of core state and the truth sense is that there's wide open access to compassion, generosity, compassion for the self, and the capacity to really reflect on all aspects of one's being and functioning and relatedness, past, present, future. And that what in attachment theory correlates most highly with resilience in the face of trauma and with security of attachment, which is the capacity to have a coherent and cohesive autobiographical narrative. It is exactly the capacity for that, that occurs in core state. And it is really where all of the changes that we're working to bring about really become consolidated as the person's access to integrative functions of affect and cognition and somatic experiencing all come together. I'm going to make one last comment, which is this, that it is really in core state that AEDP joins with spiritual traditions and traditions of mindfulness. And we have the same phenomena arrived at through the process of an attachment-based emotional processing of suffering and trauma. And it is because of core state that I think we have something very important to contribute, which is that compassion, generosity, self-compassion, kindness, that all of these are not moral values that have to be instilled and taught, but that they're rather natural qualities of the mind that emerge in safe environments. I thank you. Thank you.